I remember the day we decided to leave Missouri as if it were yesterday, though the dust and sun of the West had already carved their memory into my skin. The year was 1849, and the air in our small township carried a fever unlike any I had felt before, a fever for gold, for promise, for the horizon itself. Families packed what they could into wagons, their eyes fixed on the distant Sierra Nevadas and the lands beyond. But for my family, the call of the West carried not just hope, but necessity. The crops had failed again, the river had betrayed the banks, and the promise of California's valleys seemed a lifeline. I, Amos Carpenter, was no stranger to tools and timber. My hands had worked the plow and the wheel, but they had also tinkered with locks, axles, and the crude mechanisms that kept a frontier home standing. I had heard stories, tales whispered at the tavern, passed along by traders of men like Jedediah Smith, whose travels spanned the Rockies to the Pacific, and Kit Carson, whose cunning and skill in wilderness survival made him a legend. It was from these men that I drew, not bravado, but a careful study. If a man could navigate the wilds and deserts of the West, I reckoned, so could I with the right preparation. Our plan was simple in thought, impossible in execution, to cross the deserts, the mountains, and the endless stretch of the unknown to reach California. Friends and neighbors shook their heads. "Death Valley," they said, the words like a curse and a warning intertwined. "No man comes through that place with wagon and family intact." The name itself carried a weight, and I could feel it settle into my chest as I examined maps spread across our rough wooden table. Death Valley, the valley where men disappear, where heat stifled lungs and water vanished as if swallowed by the very earth. I traced the lines with my finger, imagining the jagged mountains, the scorched flats, and the salt pans that gleamed white in the sun like some malevolent mirror. Mary, my wife, bustled about the room, tying flour sacks and securing the limited tools we could spare. She was practical, steady, and fierce in her own quiet way. I had learned long ago that a man's ingenuity is nothing without a partner who can see the danger he might overlook. Our 2 children, barely old enough to walk long distances without complaint, clung to her skirts, eyes wide at the thought of leaving the familiar wooden fences behind for the unknown desert. I examined our wagon, a sturdy Conestoga we had purchased from the blacksmith on the edge of town. It was robust, yes, but I knew it would not withstand Death Valley without modification. The axles were thick, yet not thick enough. The wheels could sink into soft sand and break under weight. I measured and sketched in the margins of my journal, drawing ideas for reinforcement iron bands, cross braces, hidden water compartments beneath the floorboards. I recalled reading in Larpenteur's memoirs of men who had reinforced their wagons to carry furs across the upper Missouri, and I borrowed what I could from those tales. The mountain men had traveled light, yes, but they had also understood how to manipulate every piece of wood, every rope, to their advantage. Supplies were our next concern. Flour, dried meat, beans, and coffee, we packed them tightly, calculating the rations carefully. Water, of course, would be our most pressing concern. I devised a plan for barrels hidden within the wagon's frame, lined with pitch to prevent leakage and wrapped in blankets to slow the sun's cruel assault. I drew upon the techniques James Willard Schultz described among the Blackfeet, using the earth to cool water and seeking hidden springs known only to the birds and the wind. Every detail mattered, every ounce of neglect could be fatal. Route planning was another matter entirely. Most wagons followed the old Spanish Trail or the California Trail, and for good reason. Those who strayed into the valley's heart were seldom heard from again. Maps were scarce, and what information we had was often second-hand stories of mirages, of oxen collapsing from thirst, of travelers driven mad by the relentless heat. I plotted a course that would hug the mountain's edge as much as possible, seeking shade and the rare waterhole, while avoiding the valley's infamous salt flats, which could swallow a wagon whole. I consulted the Rocky Mountain fur trade journals for reference, noting the passages where mountain men had described desert crossings and narrow passes that, though treacherous, could provide a lifeline if approached with care. As the day of departure approached, the tension in our camp was palpable. Neighbors offered warnings, some offered advice, and a few quietly admired our determination. I spent long nights at the wagon, adjusting wheels, reinforcing joints, and inspecting every rope and fastener. The sun burned the plains, and the wind carried a dry, biting scent that made even the livestock restless. I learned to watch the behavior of our oxen. They sensed danger long before we did. Their ears twitched at distant sounds, their hooves faltered on hidden soft spots in the soil, and I listened to every shift in their breathing. A mountain man survives by reading the world in small, subtle ways, and I intended to carry that lesson into the desert. On the morning of our departure, the sun had barely cleared the horizon. Mist lingered over the fields, and the sky glowed pale pink and gold. Mary secured the children in the wagon, offering small comforts and reminders to be brave. I climbed onto the driver's bench, reins in hand, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle over my shoulders. The wagon creaked under the load, a sound both promising and worrying, and I murmured a silent prayer not of religion, but of calculation, foresight, and vigilance. We were leaving behind more than a town. We were leaving behind certainty itself. The first miles were gentle, rolling plains that belied the trials ahead. Dust clung to our boots, and the sun climbed steadily, promising the harsh heat that awaited us. Already I noted how the wagon handled uneven ground, how the iron bands absorbed shock, and how the hidden water barrels shifted slightly under motion. Every observation fed my mental log, every misstep corrected before it could become disaster. This was the mountain man's way. Learn quickly, act decisively, and never trust the land or the wagon until it has proven itself under duress. By midday, the gentle plains gave way to rocky foothills, and the first whispers of the valley reached us. The air grew hotter, the wind sharper, and the horizon trembled with heat. In the distance I could see the white shimmer of the salt flats, a treacherous mirror that seemed to swallow the sky. Even from here, the valley demanded respect. I tightened the wagon's braces one last time, glanced back at my family, and felt that singular mixture of dread and resolve. The road ahead would test every ounce of ingenuity, courage, and endurance we possessed, but I trusted in preparation, in knowledge gleaned from mountain men long gone, and in the stubborn will of a family determined to survive. The call of the West was no longer a whisper, it was a roar, carrying us toward a land both beautiful and deadly, toward the shadowed heart of Death Valley, and into a test that would demand every skill we possessed, and then some. The morning we left the foothills behind, the desert began its slow, creeping test of our resolve. The wagon groaned under the weight of our family and supplies, a low sound that echoed across the pale, dry hills. Every mile revealed a new challenge, each one sharper than the last, and I found myself constantly adjusting axle reinforcements, wheel braces, and the hidden water compartments I had spent weeks perfecting. I had learned from the journals of mountain men that survival depended as much on preparation as it did on skill, and already the lessons of Smith, Carson, and Carpenter proved their worth. The problem with wagons, I realized, is that they were rarely built for death and desert. Conestoga wagons were sturdy enough for the plains, but sand and salt flats were an entirely different enemy. Even a modest slope could jam a wheel or snap an axle. Our wagon, heavy with flour, dried meat, and precious water, needed more than brute strength. It required ingenuity. I had spent nights sketching ways to reinforce the axles with iron bands, adding extra planks for support, and devising a suspension system using layered leather straps, a method I recalled reading about in the memoirs of frontier traders. Every modification was carefully measured, every nail driven with intention. The wagon itself was no longer a simple vehicle, it was a lifeboat, a shelter, a repository of survival. The terrain tested us quickly. Loose sand gave way beneath the oxen's hooves, causing the wheels to dig in. I jumped down to dig the first stubborn wheel free, my hands blistered from the hot wood and rope. Sweat ran down my face, and even the children, bundled in blankets, squirmed in the sun's heat. I could hear the metal bands flex under pressure, a sound that set my teeth on edge. If one axle failed here, in the heart of the desert, there would be no chance of repair. We would be stranded, at the mercy of heat, hunger, and the merciless winds that swept across the valley. Mary noticed my concern. "Amos," she said, her voice calm but firm, "You've built this wagon better than any I've ever seen. Trust it." I nodded, though the words were reassurance more for her than for me. The wagon was a marvel of frontier ingenuity, yes, but it was also a fragile thing under the stress of Death Valley. I had learned from the mountain men that faith alone was not enough. Observation and action were equally critical. The secret design of the wagon came into play almost immediately. I had constructed hidden water compartments beneath the wagon's floor, sealed with pitch and lined with cedar for insulation. Each barrel was carefully balanced to prevent tipping, yet accessible enough that we could reach water without exposing it to the sun. I checked the fittings constantly, listening for the telltale rattle of loose fastenings. It was not enough to survive the terrain. One had to survive unnoticed dangers, cracks, dry rot, shifting weight. Every detail mattered. By midday, the valley had begun to reveal its true character. The sun burned like a forge overhead, and the flat stretches of salt and sand stretched endlessly in every direction. I had heard stories of men wandering into this expanse and disappearing, of oxen collapsing, wagons sinking, and families driven to despair. Now I could feel it all: the oppressive heat, the weight of the sun, the disorienting glare of the flats. My eyes flicked constantly to the horizon, seeking signs of water, shade, or a break in the monotony of the desert. The mountain men had taught me to read the land with patience, to notice subtle cues, a shift in wind, a single clump of grass, the distant flight of birds. It was in these small signals that survival was written. We encountered our first major obstacle when the wagon sank into a patch of soft sand. The oxen strained, their hooves slipping, and the wagon tilted dangerously. I jumped down, grabbed a shovel, and began digging, while Mary and the children watched with wide eyes. The secret design came to my aid. The reinforced wheels, bound with iron bands, held their shape despite the sinking, and the axle braces prevented collapse. I wedged planks beneath the wheels and guided the oxen with careful commands. Slowly, painfully, we freed the wagon, and I made a mental note. Even the best design must be complemented by human skill and vigilance. The desert had another lesson in store. A sudden gust of wind lifted fine sand into the air, reducing visibility to mere feet. The sun's rays bounced off the salt flats, creating mirages that threatened to confuse our sense of direction. I remembered the words of Smith's journal: "One must not follow the eye alone. The earth speaks to those who listen." I felt the ground beneath my boots, observed the sparse vegetation, and noted the direction of the wind. The secret wagon design had a canvas flap I could drop to protect our supplies and the family from drifting sand. A small innovation inspired by the shelters I had read of in mountain man accounts. It was enough to keep our provisions intact, though the heat still pressed down like a physical weight. As we continued, I reflected on the ingenuity of those who had traveled before us. Beckworth, Schultz, and the other mountain men had crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers not with brute strength alone, but with cunning, patience, and respect for the land. Their lessons were etched into my mind: use the terrain, understand your animals, preserve your water, and always plan for contingencies. I spoke softly to the children about what we were doing, explaining why the wagon had these secret compartments, why we had reinforced every joint. It was a survival lesson, yes, but also a way to keep morale steady, to instill a sense of purpose in their small, sunburned bodies. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the valley. We made camp on a slight rise where a few sparse shrubs offered minimal shade. I inspected the wagon again, checking the axles, the wheels, and the water compartments. Everything held, for now. I knew the desert would offer more tests, and that each mile would be harder than the last. But the secret design, the combination of frontier ingenuity, mechanical skill, and observation, was our best weapon against the valley's wrath. That night, as the temperature dropped surprisingly fast in the desert air, I lay awake beside the wagon. The children slept fitfully, and Mary tended a small fire, careful not to draw attention or waste precious fuel. I traced the outline of the valley on my mental map, planning the next day's route, calculating distances to waterholes, and considering alternate paths should the terrain prove impassable. Each decision mattered. A wrong turn, a broken axle, a missed spring, any could mean disaster. But for now, our wagon, our secret design, and our careful planning held us together. It was a fragile balance, but one built with the knowledge and cunning of the mountain men who had come before. The desert was far from conquered. Death Valley had already tested our resolve, and I knew that harsher trials awaited. But the wagon, our lifeline and shield, remained intact, and with it a glimmer of hope that ingenuity, preparation, and respect for the land could overcome even the most feared of deserts. The next morning the sun rose with a relentless intensity, painting the desert in blinding white and harsh gold. Even before we moved, the heat pressed against our skin, and the wagon's wooden frame radiated the sun's fury like a furnace. The children squinted against the glare, and I shaded my eyes, squinting across the expanse of sand and salt flats that stretched endlessly before us. This was the heart of Death Valley, the place whispered about in fearful tones by travelers and traders alike. Stories of men disappearing, wagons swallowed by shifting sands, and waterless days haunted my thoughts, but there was no turning back. The valley demanded passage, and we had chosen to answer its challenge. The first few miles were deceptive. The ground appeared solid, but under the wagon's weight, it shifted treacherously. The wheels sank into pockets of soft sand, and the oxen strained to pull the heavy load. I dismounted to inspect the rear axle, running my hands along the iron bands I had installed weeks earlier. Sweat dripped from my brow, stinging my eyes, but the metal held firm. I inserted a makeshift lever, fashioned from a forked branch, and began prying the wheel free, following techniques I had learned from the mountain men's journals. Each twist, each shove, reminded me that in the desert, the smallest error could turn survival into calamity. Mary guided the children with calm authority, reminding them to stay in the wagon and conserve their energy. Even their small bodies, exposed to sun and dust, absorbed the desert's cruelty. I checked the water compartments, grateful that the hidden barrels were intact, insulated, and cool despite the heat. They were our lifeline, a secret design born from countless hours of thought and trial. Every ounce of water mattered, and I rationed it carefully, giving just enough for the oxen and family to continue, knowing the valley would test us further before we reached another spring or creek. By midday, the desert revealed its true face. Heat shimmered in waves off the salt flats, distorting the horizon into mirages that mocked the weary traveler. The oxen slowed, their flanks slick with sweat, and the wagon groaned as wheels ground against the shifting sand. I realized that our route would not be straightforward. The valley had hidden challenges, narrow passes, and treacherous ridges that demanded constant vigilance. I paused, squinting at the terrain, and plotted a path that hugged the higher ground, where sand was firmer but still soft enough to test our wagon's strength. The first major trial came in the form of a steep incline composed of loose gravel and sand. The wagon tilted dangerously, and I jumped down, grabbing ropes to anchor it while guiding the oxen. The reinforced axles strained, but the cross braces held. I remembered reading Larpenteur's accounts of fur traders hauling heavy loads up mountains in similar conditions. It was the ingenuity of bracing, balancing, and leverage that kept their wagons intact. I mirrored those techniques, using logs as temporary, rollers and levers to lift the wagon's weight when a wheel threatened to collapse into the sand. Hours passed in this painstaking method, each foot gained a victory, each inch a testament to preparation. As the sun climbed higher, the valley seemed to stretch endlessly. Salt flats reflected blinding sunlight, and the wind stirred fine particles into the air, coating our skin and clothing. The children, growing restless and frightened, clung to Mary's skirts. I found myself speaking to them softly, recounting tales of mountain men crossing deserts, rivers, and mountains. Jedediah Smith once traveled hundreds of miles with nothing but his wits and a single horse, I said. He watched the land, learned its secrets, and survived where others perished. That is what we must do now. The words were more for myself than for them, a reminder that survival demanded focus, ingenuity, and patience. Around mid-afternoon, the heat began to take its toll. The oxen staggered, their breaths heavy and labored, and the children complained of thirst and exhaustion. I stopped under the shadow of a low ridge, giving the animals a brief respite and checking the wagon. The secret compartments worked exactly as intended. Hidden barrels of water kept cool, insulated from the sun, and enough for the family to refresh without draining our precious supply. I felt a surge of relief. Months of preparation had culminated in this moment, and the ingenuity of a reinforced, mechanically mindful design had prevented disaster. The wagon was no longer just a vehicle, it was a carefully engineered tool of survival, a mobile lifeline in a desert that would have claimed us otherwise. But Death Valley had more lessons to impart. As we resumed, the terrain shifted suddenly to a vast expanse of salt pan, its surface deceptively firm. I knew from historical accounts that beneath the crystalline crust lay soft mud, ready to trap a wagon and oxen alike. Each step was calculated. I prodded the surface with a stick before guiding the oxen forward, testing the integrity of the crust. Once a wheel broke through slightly, and I quickly inserted a plank beneath it, redistributing weight until the wagon stabilized. The children watched, wide-eyed, as I worked, and I could see their understanding growing not in words, but in observation, the same way mountain men taught their companions the language of the land. That night our camp was meager, a small fire shielded by rocks, the wagon's sides providing limited shade from the wind that carried salt and dust. We shared a scant meal, rationing carefully. Mary tended to the children, brushing dust from their hair and murmuring comfort. I inspected the wagon once more, noting the minor flecks in the rear axle and the wear on the iron bands. It would hold, I told myself, though only just. Every mile forward would test it further, and I had to remain vigilant. The desert was patient, it would not forgive complacency. Before sleep, I walked the perimeter of our camp, observing the faint tracks of coyotes and the distant rise of mountains that marked the valley's edge. The land spoke to me, in whispers of wind and rustle of sand, revealing both danger and guidance. The mountain men had taught me to trust these subtle cues, to read the earth as one reads a journal. I traced the line of a faint creek bed, noting its possible use as a route or temporary refuge. Survival was as much about foresight as it was about immediate action, and in this, the wagon's secret design was merely a part of the equation. Knowledge, observation, and patience were equally critical. That night, as the desert cooled surprisingly fast, I lay beside the wagon, listening to the quiet rhythm of the oxen breathing and the low murmur of the family within. The valley had already tested us, and we had passed the first trials, but I knew the hardest miles were yet to come. The secret wagon design, the hidden water barrels, reinforced axles, and clever suspension had kept us alive, but it was our vigilance, patience, and understanding of the land that truly ensured our survival. Tomorrow, the desert would demand more, and we would answer, one careful step at a time. By the fourth day in the valley, the land had stripped away all pretenses of mercy. The sun rose white and unfeeling, the sky a vast sheet of pale fire that seemed to press down upon us with invisible weight. Our oxen stumbled more often than not, and even the creak of the wagon seemed slower, heavier, as though the wood itself had grown weary of the endless struggle. Every sound, from the crunch of sand beneath boots to the rattle of our canteens, carried through the still air like the ticking of a clock counting down. In those moments of silence and heat, I found myself reaching not just for tools or water, but for the lessons of the men who had faced such trials before. Jedediah Smith had crossed this very stretch of country, or near enough, with little more than faith and grit to sustain him. I had read his journal how he mapped the desert by the flight of birds, how he knew that the shadow of a circling raven meant water somewhere close. It was a language of land and life that most men never learned, but here, in this crucible, I understood its worth. When the air shimmered and the horizon played its cruel tricks, pools of water that vanished as we neared, distant groves that turned to bare rock, I remembered Smith's words, "A man's eyes will lie to him in the desert, but the earth does not." So I trusted not what I saw, but what I felt. The ground beneath my boots told me of its moisture or dryness. A patch of greener scrub hinted at underground seepage. The pattern of animal tracks, jackrabbit, coyote, lizard, revealed where life dared to linger. Mary watched me kneel, scoop sand in my hands, sniff the air, and study the sky. "You're talking to the land again," she said quietly, her face half hidden beneath her sunscarf. "I'm listening," I replied. "It speaks, if you're patient." That afternoon, I guided us toward a line of low hills to the west. The valley floor was death, a trap of heat and light, but the hills might hold what the mountain men called the living shade, where the earth rose just high enough to hide a trickle of water or a pocket of cooler air. As we climbed, I noted a scattering of mesquite and sage, their roots clutching at life. Then I saw a faint depression where the sand darkened slightly. My pulse quickened. I ordered the wagon to halt and began digging with a tin cup in my hands. A few inches down, the soil was damp. Not much, but enough. "Mary," I called softly, "bring the canvas bucket." We deepened the hole, and within an hour, water began to seep slowly into the hollow. It was brackish, warm, and tasted faintly of metal, but it was water nonetheless. We filled every canteen, the hidden barrels beneath the wagon's floor, and even soaked the oxen's lips to cool them. The children's eyes brightened, though exhaustion dulled their excitement. It wasn't a river or spring, but it was life, and it had come from observation, not luck. That night, we built no fire. The wind had changed, carrying a scent of dust and far-off rain. I remembered how Kit Carson had once described using the stars to read wind and weather, the subtle arcs of constellations shifting with the pressure of the earth below. I studied the sky, noting how the northern lights flickered faintly along the horizon, though we were far south of their usual dance. It meant a storm was stirring somewhere beyond the mountains. And sure enough, before dawn, it came. It began as a whisper, a tremor in the air, then grew into a deep roar as sand lifted from the valley floor in a sweeping, choking wave. The oxen bawled in terror. I shouted orders, though the wind tore my voice away. "Drop the canvas, lash it tight." The wagon's secret design, the collapsible canopy I'd fashioned from oiled canvas and wagon bows, was our salvation. We secured it in moments, creating a tight seal over the supplies and the family inside. The storm hit us like a living thing. Sand hissed through every crack, stinging our faces and scouring the wagon's wood raw. I threw myself against the wind, holding down a loosened flap, my eyes burning. The desert screamed for hours, its fury unrelenting. I thought of Hugh Glass, left for dead in the wilderness, crawling through storms and hunger with nothing but stubborn will. I thought of Beckworth, whose blood and cunning had carried him through battles and blizzards alike. Their lessons burned in me now. Endure, adapt, survive. When the storm finally passed, silence returned, a silence so vast it rang in my ears. We emerged from the wagon covered in dust but alive. The oxen trembled but still stood. The wagon, our lifeline, had held firm. The reinforced axles, the braced wheels, the sealed canopy, all had done their work. I ran my hand along the scarred wood, feeling both pride and humility. Mary caught my eye, her face streaked with grit and sweat. "That wagon of yours," she said softly, "might just be the reason we lived to see California." I nodded. "Not just the wagon," I said. "The lessons that built it." In the days that followed, I relied even more on those lessons. I used the wagon's leather straps to create a crude windbreak when gusts threatened to overturn us. I fashioned a simple compass from a magnetized needle and a drop of water, using tricks described in Schultz's accounts of the Blackfeet. When food began to dwindle, I showed the children how to find edible cactus pads and desert roots, their moisture sustaining us when our stores ran low. The land was harsh, but not cruel. It offered what it could, if one knew where and how to look. Each day became a test of ingenuity, patience, and reverence. And as I studied, the mountains ahead, their distant outlines shimmering through the haze, I felt a strange calm settle over me. We were no longer merely crossing the desert. We were part of it, shaped and tempered by its trials, guided by the wisdom of those who had walked these paths long before us. The mountain men had taught through their scars and stories that survival was never a single act. It was a series of choices, each one made with care, courage, and respect for the world around you. As night fell again, the stars blazed cold and clear above the valley. I lay beside the wagon, the sand still warm beneath my back, and thought of the miles yet to come. Our secret design had carried us through the storm. The lessons of the frontier had carried us through despair. But Death Valley was not yet done testing us. The hardest ground, I knew, still lay ahead. The morning after the storm broke with a cruel kind of beauty. The valley lay scoured clean, its sand swept into new ridges and hollows, the air sharp with the scent of dust and iron. The sun had not yet crested the distant peaks, but the horizon burned with a faint red line, a warning, not a promise. I rose before the others, my joints stiff and my throat dry as leather. We had water enough for 2 days, maybe 3, if rationed carefully. But the oxen drank more than their share. Without them, we'd never reach the Sierra foothills. I checked their hides and eyes, running a hand down their necks. They were gaunt and restless, tongues flicking for moisture. The last seep we'd found was already behind us, and ahead stretched 100 miles of pale, unbroken sand. Mary joined me, her shawl drawn tight against the morning chill. "You're thinking too loud again," she said softly. I smiled faintly. "Thinking's about all I can do until the sun's high enough to see the land proper." Her gaze followed mine toward the west. "You said there'd be a spring before the mountains." "There should be," I said. "But should and is are 2 different things out here." We ate little that morning, hard biscuits softened with the last of the coffee water. The children were quiet, their eyes hollow from thirst and heat. I could see in Mary's face that she was holding herself together for them, her strength drawn from some deep, unspoken reserve. As we started moving, I guided the wagon by instinct more than map. The compass I'd fashioned still floated true, but the wind had erased any clear sign of trail. Every dune looked like the next. The trick, I remembered from Jedediah Smith's writings, was to trust not the eye but the rhythm of the ground, the subtle rise that meant you were following an old riverbed, the curve that hinted at erosion, and, possibly, water. By mid-morning, the heat had become a living thing, crawling up from the sand in shimmering waves. The wagon wheels sank deep, groaning under the strain. I walked ahead, scanning for any sign of vegetation or animal. Tracks. Then I saw it, a scattering of low, waxy shrubs clinging to a shallow basin. I knelt, pressing my palm to the earth. It was warm, dry, but beneath I could feel a trace of coolness. We dug for hours. The sand shifted like water, collapsing back into the hole. I rigged a frame from spare spokes and a hide strip to brace the sides. By the time the sun dipped westward, a dark gleam appeared at the bottom, a slow trickle of brown water seeped from the stubborn earth itself. "Sweet mercy," Mary breathed, her voice cracking. It wasn't much, but it was enough. We filtered it through cloth, boiled it with the wagon's iron pot, and drank in silence. Every swallow burned going down, but it filled the hollows inside us that fear had carved. The oxen drank next, their eyes softening as they lapped. That night, under a sky thick with stars, I worked by firelight, repairing the wagon's wheel rims, heat-warped from the day's strain. I used a strip of iron I'd scavenged from it, the rear axle's brace, heated it until it glowed red, then hammered it flat with the back of my hatchet. Each strike rang through the desert, sharp and lonely. The children watched from the wagon bed, the flickering firelight turning their faces bronze and ghostly. "Pa," the youngest asked, "how do you know how to fix all that?" I paused, resting the hammer. "Because somebody once taught me to pay attention," I said. "Every man who lived through these mountains left behind a lesson. I just learned to listen." Mary smiled faintly from the shadows. "And what lesson's this one?" I held the glowing strip of iron up, watching sparks fall. "That when the world breaks, you don't curse it, you bend it back into shape." The desert cooled fast after dark, as it always did. The fire crackled low, and I lay awake, listening to the faint creak of the wagon wood as it settled. I thought of those who'd come before the trappers, scouts, wanderers who'd walked this same path long before any wagon trail was marked. Men who'd built rafts from green hides, trapped beaver in frozen streams, eaten pine bark and mule flesh just to see another dawn. Their stories weren't about glory. They were about grit, the kind that comes from a man's refusal to die where he stands. and as I lay there beneath the cold sweep of the stars, I realized that same grit now flowed in the small, trembling hands of my children, in the set of Mary's jaw, in every splintered inch of that wagon. The next day dawned crueler than before. The wind rose early, not as a storm, but a steady, scorching breath that drained the moisture from our skin. By noon, the seep had dried again, and the ground began to shimmer with a false promise of water just beyond reach. We pushed onward, the oxen stumbling, the wheels dragging. My lips cracked, my tongue swelled. Every step felt heavier than the last. Then, sometime near dusk, I saw smoke thin, gray, and rising from a cut between two hills. At first I thought it a mirage, but as we drew closer, the smell reached me sharp, acrid, familiar. Not wood smoke, but burning sage. I climbed one of the hills, dragging my rifle for balance. At the top, the valley below opened like a bowl of gold and stone, and there, tucked beneath a bluff, was a shallow spring feeding a narrow creek. The smoke came from an old fire pit beside it, long, cold, but still rimmed with blackened stones. Someone had camped there maybe years ago, maybe days. Whoever it was, they'd known the land's secrets. I signaled to Mary, and soon we had the oxen drinking, the canteens filled, and the wagon parked under the shade of the bluff. Relief washed through me. But so did something else, a feeling of kinship with that unknown traveler who had once knelt here, tending a fire as I did now. As night fell, I built our own fire atop the same stones. The flames flickered high, painting the rock face in gold. I sat beside it, whittling a new haft for my hatchet from a piece of desert willow. The wood was dry, tough, and honest. Mary settled beside me, her hand brushing mine. "You think whoever made that fire ever made it out?" she asked. I looked into the flames. "If they knew what we know now," I said quietly, "they might have." The silence that followed was thick, peaceful in its way. Above us, the stars burned bright and close, and for the first time in many days, the air carried the faint murmur of running water. I felt then what the mountain men must have felt when they carved their lives from wilderness, not triumph, not pride, but a solemn gratitude. The land had tested us, broken us down, and taught us to listen. In its own harsh tongue, it had given us everything we needed to endure. And so, as the fire crackled low and the night wrapped around us, I promised myself one thing, that if we reached the other side of these mountains, I'd remember every lesson the land had taught. Because out here, wisdom wasn't written in books or maps, it was carved into a man's bones, one hardship at a time. By the time we reached the foothills, the land had changed its face again. Gone were the endless dunes and burning wind. The air grew cooler, heavier, with the scent of pine and granite dust. Jagged ridges rose before us like the bones of the earth itself, streaked with snow and shadow. The Sierra Nevada, beautiful, terrible, and final. We camped at the mouth of a canyon where the creek we'd followed turned to froth and thunder, cutting its way through boulders older than memory. The oxen grazed on sparse grass while I studied the range ahead. Each pass I traced with my spyglass seemed impassable, sheer cliffs, snowfields, and rock slides that swallowed the sky. Yet somewhere among those peaks lay the only path west. Mary joined me, wrapping her shawl tight against the cold. "Looks like the end of the world," she said softly. "In a way it is," I answered. "But on the other side, if we can reach it, there's a new one waiting." We rested 2 days, repairing the wagon and gathering strength. I reinforced the wheel spokes with rawhide and lashings, greased the axles with bear fat I'd saved since the plains, and checked every bolt and brace. The wagon had carried us through fire and sand. Now it would face rock and ice. At dawn on the 3rd day, we began the ascent. The trail, if one could call it that, wound through steep ravines where boulders forced us to unload and haul the supplies by hand. The oxen strained, their hooves slipping on loose shale. Each creak of the wagon sounded like a prayer and a threat combined. By noon, clouds gathered thick, low, and gray as lead. A wind rose through the canyons, cold enough to bite the skin. I could smell snow coming. We pushed harder, every man and beast bent forward into the climb. My hands bled from the rope as I guided the wagon up a narrow incline, inch by inch. At one point, the rear wheel slid, catching the edge of a drop that plunged 100 feet to the rocks below. Mary screamed. I threw my shoulder against the wheel, shouting for the eldest boy to wedge a stone beneath it. For one terrible moment, the whole wagon teetered on the brink. Then, with a groan of wood and metal, it settled back into place. We stood there in silence, the wind whistling through the pines, our hearts pounding like drums. Mary touched my arm. "If we lose that wagon—" "We won't," I said, though my voice came out rough. "It's carried us this far. It'll carry us through." That night, we made camp on a ledge overlooking the valley below. The air was thin, and the stars burned cold and white. I built a small fire from pine needles and dead branches, careful to shield the flame from the wind. We ate dried meat and hardtack, washing it down with melted snow. The children huddled close to their mother, their faces half lit by the fire. It was then, as I stared into the flames, that I remembered the old mountain man tales, the ones told around trapper fires up north, stories of men like Joseph Meek and Tom Fitzpatrick who crossed these very ranges with nothing but mules and grit. They spoke of blizzards that swallowed whole parties, of nights when firewood turned to ice, and even the stars seemed frozen. I understood then what those men meant when they said the mountains don't kill out of malice. They test, they measure, they take only those unfit to pass. By morning the snow had begun to fall. At first it was gentle, a dusting that softened the rocks and pine needles. But by midday it thickened into a relentless storm. The world turned white, the horizon vanishing in a swirl of frost. The oxen stumbled, their breath steaming in the air. I wrapped their hooves with strips of canvas to give them footing. Every few steps, I stopped to scrape ice from the wagon wheels. The cold gnawed through our coats and blankets. I could feel it in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones. We needed shelter before nightfall. I spotted a rock, overhang ahead a natural cave, half hidden behind a stand of firs. We reached it just as the light began to fade, the snow already knee-deep. Inside, it was dry and dark, smelling faintly of old smoke. Others had used it before, trappers maybe, or natives. I found a few blackened stones from an old fire pit and built ours there, coaxing flame from damp kindling. Mary unpacked the last of the flour, mixing it with melted snow to make rough cakes. We ate in silence, the fire crackling low. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, beating against the rock. The children slept huddled under buffalo robes. I sat awake, staring at the wagon through the cave mouth. It stood half buried in snow, its frame glinting faintly in the firelight. Every inch of it, every nail, joint, and brace was a piece of our hope. In that moment I thought of all the men who had vanished in these passes, their names carved only in rumor. But I also thought of the mountain men who had made it through, who'd learned to read the sky, feel the shift of snow beneath their feet, and trust their instincts above all else. When dawn came, the storm had passed, leaving a silence so deep it felt sacred. The world glittered under a crust of ice. I stepped outside, my boots crunching through the snow. The air was painfully clear, every sound magnified. Far to the west, the clouds broke just enough to reveal a glimpse of green, the promise of lower country,